didn't make it new, but his same songs, but looking at them again. And
Barbra Streisand has never been one to hold back her opinions, and at 83 years old, the legendary singer and actress is more candid than ever about her experiences in the entertainment industry. In a recent conversation, she opened up about 7 musicians she found impossible to work with over the years. Her reasons range from clashing egos and artistic differences to complete lack of chemistry, and her memories are as sharp and unforgiving as ever. The first name on Streisand's list might surprise some people: Frank Sinatra. While both were undeniable giants of their respective eras, Streisand revealed that Sinatra's controlling nature in the studio made any collaboration unbearable. She described how he would walk into a recording session, expecting everything to revolve around him, leaving no room for compromise or creative input from others. For Streisand, it became clear that working with Sinatra was more about his need for control than about creating art together. Streisand acknowledged Sinatra's incredible influence and vocal abilities, particularly praising his work from the 1950s. She admitted that his phrasing and timing were unmatched, but she learned that admiration doesn't always translate into successful partnerships. Their musical worlds crossed paths during various industry events and charity benefits, and record executives often discussed bringing them together for a duet. According to Streisand, these discussions would start with enthusiasm, but quickly fall apart due to fundamental differences in their approaches to music. The main problem wasn't just personal friction between them, but rather a completely different philosophy about how music should be made. Sinatra believed in capturing raw emotion in just 1 or 2 takes, while Streisand preferred rehearsing extensively and fine-tuning every detail. He viewed her careful preparation as overproducing, while she felt he was rushing through what could be brilliant work. When they actually attempted a joint recording session in the early 1970s, things went downhill fast. Streisand remembered that Sinatra showed up late to the session, immediately dismissed the musical arrangement she had carefully prepared, and insisted on changing the key on the spot without any discussion. She said it was like he expected the music to mold itself around him rather than working together as partners. When she tried to push back gently on some of his demands, he acted as though she had committed some terrible offense. The situation wasn't really about ego, she explained, but about his need to prove he was in charge of every situation, which had nothing to do with creating good art. During that failed recording session, Sinatra refused to harmonize on one section of the track, muttering that it wasn't his style, and then stormed out of the studio before they could even complete a full take. The session was never attempted again, and both artists moved on without looking back. Streisand also mentioned experiencing subtle sexism during her interactions with Sinatra. She described his old-school attitude that hadn't aged well, including little comments about her voice, her appearance, and her being difficult that would never have been said to a male artist. Working with Sinatra often felt like stepping back in time to an era where female ambition was seen as threatening rather than admirable. Even outside the recording studio, their personalities clashed. At one gala event in the late 1960s, Streisand recalled a particularly tense moment when Sinatra dismissed her political activism as just Hollywood noise. He had no patience for viewpoints he didn't agree with, and if you weren't completely in his corner, you were simply dismissed. Despite all these disappointments and conflicts, Streisand made it clear that she holds no grudges against Sinatra, just firm boundaries about who she's willing to work with. The second musician on Streisand's difficult list is Elvis Presley, whom she once seriously considered for a starring role in A Star is Born. However, their brief interactions left her deeply disappointed. She found Presley to be overly managed by his handlers and emotionally distant, describing their conversations as being like talking to a wax figure rather than a real person. In the early 1970s, Streisand and her partner at the time, producer John Peters, had ambitious plans for remaking A Star is Born. Before Kris Kristofferson eventually got the role, Streisand had set her sights on the biggest star in America, Elvis Presley. The idea seemed electrifying at the time, pairing the king of rock and roll with one of the most powerful female voices in entertainment. The media buzzed with speculation, and meetings were arranged to discuss the possibility. Streisand's first meeting with Presley took place at the Las Vegas Hilton, where he was performing one of his famous residencies. She arrived excited, thinking this could be a chance to do something truly historic that would offer reinvention for him and represent a bold step for her career. However, the reality of meeting Elvis was a major letdown. He was constantly surrounded by his Memphis Mafia, the bodyguards and handlers who seemed to speak for him more than he spoke for himself. Getting through to Elvis meant going through them first, making genuine communication nearly impossible. What struck Streisand most about Elvis was his complete lack of engagement during their meeting. He barely made eye contact, mostly just nodded and smiled politely, but seemed completely checked out both emotionally and mentally. There was no fire in him, no creative vision, just passive compliance with whatever was being discussed around him. She described feeling an eerie disconnect, as if the legend had become just a shadow of his former self. It felt like he was playing the role of Elvis Presley instead of actually being the person behind the legend. Streisand had been looking for a creative partner, someone who could challenge and inspire her in the role. But Elvis was already buried under the weight of his own myth and the controlling influence of those around him. His manager, Colonel Tom Parker, dominated every conversation and made increasingly outlandish demands regarding salary, billing, and creative control. The Colonel wanted complete control over Elvis's image and wardrobe in the film, even insisting that he could only sing songs written or approved by Parker's own publishing house. The situation felt suffocating to Streisand, who realized that Elvis wasn't being allowed to be himself anymore, let alone the kind of vulnerable, raw character that the role required. Despite her disappointment with how things turned out, Streisand expressed deep empathy for Elvis's situation. She believed he was trapped by fame, addiction, and the people around him, and that it wasn't entirely his fault that he couldn't be a genuine collaborator. Without that essential connection between creative partners, she knew the project just wasn't going to work. Streisand had once envisioned scenes of emotional depth and musical magic between them, the kind of work that could have reshaped Elvis's image and re-energized his career during a difficult period. However, the reality didn't match her dreams, and she ultimately moved on to cast Kristofferson in a role that reignited his film career. Looking back, she doesn't regret not working with Elvis, only the lost potential of what it could have been if circumstances had been different. The third musician Streisand found impossible to work with was David Bowie. While she admired his artistry from a distance, she found him impossible to collaborate with in person. She described him as being enigmatic to a fault, explaining that every time they tried to work together, it felt like he was speaking in riddles rather than having real conversations about making music together. Streisand had long respected Bowie's ability to constantly reinvent himself, from Ziggy Stardust to the Thin White Duke, and she admired his willingness to push artistic boundaries in ways that other musicians wouldn't dare. She found his fearlessness with his image and sound thrilling to watch as an outsider. When an opportunity came in the late 1970s to potentially collaborate on a genre-defying duet for a television special, Streisand was genuinely intrigued by the possibilities. She believed they could create something truly boundary-breaking, a rare fusion of glam rock eccentricity with Broadway polish that nobody would see coming. Their first meeting took place in London at a quiet, art-filled cafe that Bowie had personally chosen. Streisand arrived expecting a straightforward conversation about music, arrangements, and their mutual creative vision. Instead, what she got felt more like a philosophy seminar led by someone who didn't believe in keeping track of time. According to Streisand, Bowie was charming but elusive, speaking primarily in broad metaphors and abstract ideas that had little connection to the practical aspects of making music together. When she asked about tempo, He responded with quotes about time being an illusion. When she wanted to discuss melody, he asked whether she believed in parallel dimensions. While she found his mind dazzling, the experience was also exhausting because it never seemed to lead anywhere concrete. The real challenge came when they actually got into the recording studio to test out a track together. Streisand arrived fully prepared with lyrics annotated and vocal cues planned out in advance, while Bowie preferred to improvise everything on the spot. He didn't want to rehearse or plan ahead, instead wanting to feel tiand, room, and let the moment dictate what the melody should be. While Streisand could appreciate the beauty of that approach in theory, she found that in practice it became complete chaos when trying to shape a song together. Bowie kept changing musical direction in the middle of sessions, switching moods, instruments, and themes without any warning or discussion. One moment he wanted to create synth pop, and the next it was ambient jazz. Streisand described it as being like trying to chase a balloon in the wind. Despite Bowie's undeniable charisma and vocal talent, she found the entire experience frustratingly abstract and impossible to build upon. Streisand explained that she needed connection and structure in her creative partnerships. She needed to look across the room and see someone who was meeting her halfway in the collaborative process. With Bowie, she felt like she was constantly chasing shadows rather than working with a real partner. Their creative styles were simply too fundamentally different to coexist productively. She described herself as grounded and needing structure, while he was floating, poetic, but completely untethered to practical concerns. After a few sessions, the collaboration was quietly dropped without any official recordings being completed. Both artists moved on without making any public comments about why things didn't work out. Even so, Streisand insisted that she never disliked Bowie personally, recognizing that he was a genius in his own right. However, she learned that not everyone's genius plays well with others. And with Bowie, she never felt anchored or stable enough to create something meaningful together. Miles Davis represents the fourth musician on Streisand's list of difficult collaborations. While she fully acknowledged his genius and revolutionary impact on music, she called working with him a total disaster. She cited his dismissive attitude and complete lack of interest in anything outside of jazz as major roadblocks that made collaboration impossible. Streisand has always had deep respect for musical innovators, and Miles Davis was certainly no exception to that rule. She called him revolutionary and credited his fearless creativity with fundamentally changing the sound of modern music. She recognized that his influence could be heard everywhere, in phrasing, in mood, and in how people think about space and rhythm in music. However, when their paths crossed in a proposed recording collaboration in the late 1980s, the mutual professional respect quickly gave way to a fundamental creative clash that couldn't be resolved. The project was originally pitched by a prominent producer who thought the pairing of Streisand's soaring theatrical voice with Davis's moody trumpet work would break completely new ground in music. Streisand was open to the idea and curious about exploring a more improvisational jazz sound than she was known for. She thought they could create something cinematic, a true dialogue between voice and horn that would be unlike anything either had done before. However, their first recording session set the tone for what would become an uphill battle from start to finish. Streisand arrived with sheet music, vocal charts, and a detailed sense of how the arrangement should work. Davis, in contrast, showed up late, barely acknowledged anyone else in the room, and declined to even look at any of the materials that had been carefully prepared for the session. He said very few words, looked at the charts, shook his head, and simply said they didn't need any of that preparation. What followed was what Streisand described as an awkward standoff disguised as a jam session. Davis played a few bars that felt completely disconnected from her vocal cues, and when she tried to adjust her approach to match his phrasing, he abruptly stopped playing altogether. She described it as trying to sing into a void, where he wasn't reacting or engaging with her performance, just playing whatever he felt like, and expecting everyone else to somehow keep up with his unpredictable changes. Streisand noted that there was absolutely no room for communication or compromise in Davis's approach. When she would ask simple questions about trying a different key or whether she should follow his lead on tempo, he would just shrug or turn away without answering. It wasn't shyness or artistic temperament, she explained, but clear dismissal of her input and presence in the collaboration. The worst part for Streisand wasn't just the disconnection, but the obvious disdain that Davis showed for her efforts. He made it clear that she was out of her element and didn't belong in his musical world. There was no encouragement, no attempt at collaboration, just silence or eye rolls when she tried to contribute. She tried repeatedly to bridge the gap between their different approaches, suggesting they find common ground by exploring composers like Gershwin or Cole Porter, whom they both admired. Davis dismissed this idea entirely, saying he was done with what he called museum music. Even attempts to connect between takes were unsuccessful. When Streisand tried to make small talk or ask about his musical influences, he would either ignore her completely or mumble something cryptic that shut down further conversation. It became clear that he didn't want connection or collaboration, but rather complete control or nothing at all. Their final meeting ended without even a handshake or goodbye. Davis simply got up in the middle of a take, packed his horn, and left the studio while Streisand was still singing and hoping to find some way to connect with him musically. Looking back, Streisand still considers Davis a legend, but definitely not someone capable of true collaboration. She described him as existing in his own world, brilliant but completely unreachable. When someone refuses to meet you halfway in a creative partnership, she learned, you eventually have to stop walking toward them. While the experience was painful at the time, it taught her a valuable lesson that even shared genius can't overcome a fundamental lack of mutual respect. Prince represents the fifth musician on Streisand's list of impossible collaborations. The pair reportedly explored the possibility of a duet in the late 1980s, but Streisand found Prince's secrecy and unpredictability made any real collaboration impossible. She described trying to work with him as being like chasing a ghost who could never be pinned down or scheduled. Streisand had long been fascinated by Prince's musical genius, his boundary-pushing style, his mastery of multiple instruments, and his genre-defying songwriting abilities. She admired his fearlessness in taking funk, rock, R&B, and gospel, and blending them together into something completely original. That admiration led to conversations in the late 1980s about a potential duet, at a time when Streisand was experimenting with new sounds and collaborators, while Prince was riding high on the success of Sign o' the Times. The initial idea was to record a haunting, slow-tempo ballad that would combine orchestral flourishes with Prince's signature funk-infused grooves, creating something that could bridge both of their musical worlds. They spoke on the phone several times, and Streisand remembered Prince having a very soft voice, almost a whisper, as he talked in riddles like he was half poet and half mystic. She often hung up the phone wondering if they had actually had a real conversation, or if she had somehow dreamed the entire exchange. When it came to actual planning, everything unraveled quickly. Streisand, known for her detailed preparation and perfectionist standards, attempted to coordinate basic logistics for their collaboration. She offered potential studio times, proposed locations, and even sent a rough draft of a lyrical theme to work from. Prince would respond days or sometimes weeks later, often with cryptic notes or audio snippets that had little or no connection to the original plan they had discussed. He would send her unlabeled cassette tapes with no instructions, just soundscapes, ambient noises, or maybe a single line of vocals. While these mysterious packages were often beautiful in their own way, Streisand had no idea what she was supposed to do with them or how they related to their potential collaboration. It felt like trying to work with someone who was already halfway through a dream that only he could understand. Things reached a breaking point when Streisand's team went ahead and booked a recording session at Sunset Sound in Los Angeles, and Prince simply didn't show up. There was no phone call, no cancellation, just complete silence. He later claimed that he was in the middle of something spiritual and couldn't be disturbed by mundane concerns like scheduled recording sessions. For Streisand, this was the final sign that they were completely incompatible as creative partners. She realized that you don't really collaborate with Prince in any traditional sense, but rather you orbit around him while he does whatever he wants to do. Since Streisand doesn't orbit around anybody, she knew the partnership was never going to work. She never stopped admiring his incredible brilliance and visionary approach to music, but she also made peace with the fact that they were simply incompatible. She described Prince as being a world unto himself, an incredible visionary but completely untouchable when it came to real collaboration. Eric Clapton represents the sixth musician on Streisand's list of difficult collaborations. Despite his legendary status as a guitarist, Streisand said his obvious lack of enthusiasm for her musical style made working together extremely difficult. She could feel his disinterest and eye-rolling attitude throughout their time together, making it clear that they existed on completely different planets musically. The possibility of working with Clapton arose in the early 1990s when Streisand was experimenting with more acoustic textures and organic production methods for an upcoming album. Clapton's name came up frequently in discussions, not just because of his incredible mastery of the guitar, but because his tone and phrasing could potentially bring a raw, soulful edge to her songs. Streisand had always admired his guitar work and the way he could bend a single note to tell an entire story. But she learned once again that admiration doesn't always translate into successful chemistry. They were introduced through mutual friends in the music industry, and a tentative recording session was arranged in Los Angeles. From the very beginning, Streisand noticed that Clapton appeared completely detached from the project. He came in late wearing sunglasses and barely said hello to anyone in the room. While he was polite enough on the surface, it was obvious that his body was present, but his mind was somewhere else entirely. Streisand had prepared a reimagined ballad that she thought would be perfect for his blues-influenced style, with plenty of room for guitar improvisation and creative input. However, Clapton barely glanced at the sheet music she had prepared and declined to rehearse or discuss the arrangement in advance. His attitude was simply to play the track and figure things out as they went along, which could work if there was genuine energy and curiosity involved. But he seemed bored before they even played the first note. As they began recording, the distance between their different approaches became increasingly obvious. Clapton played with his usual technical brilliance, but his phrasing often clashed with Streisand's vocal lines in ways that didn't seem intentional or creative. She tried adjusting her delivery and offering feedback and suggestions for how they might work better together, but got very little response in return. He wasn't rude exactly, but he wasn't present either. He would nod, shrug, or maybe play something vaguely similar to what she suggested, but there was no real conversation happening between them. Streisand believes that music should be a dialogue between collaborators, but this felt like a monologue where only one person was really participating. After a few takes, it became painfully clear that the collaboration simply wasn't working for either of them. She remembered one particular moment where Clapton let out a loud, obvious sigh after she suggested doing another retake to try to find better chemistry between their parts. His impatience and desire to be anywhere else wasn't subtle at all. Later, Streisand learned through a producer that Clapton had expressed skepticism about the entire project from the very beginning, reportedly saying that her music really wasn't his thing. While she could accept that he didn't connect with her work, she felt hurt that he had agreed to participate in a session when he clearly didn't want to be there. In the end, none of the material from their session made it onto her final album, and both artists moved on without any hard feelings, but also without any desire to try working together again.